Okay, so let's build our first mechanic. First thing I want to put together is a bumper. And what this will be an object, technically a trigger volume, that when the player enters it, it will collide and reverse the direction. Kind of, you think of pinball, those little, cylindrical bouncer things that push the ball whenever they hit, and they make that cool sound. I would want to make that. So to start off with, let's make our object, and I'm going to come up here, 3D object, cylinder. That would be fine. Just as a quick side note, anytime you make a cylinder, just be aware that the default collision is not actually a cylinder, it's a capsule. If I disable this, you can see that it looks like a pill. It only matters if you're trying to build platforms out of cylinders, which in case you want to replace this with a mesh collider component instead of a capsule collider, and then select the cylinder. For now, this is fine. This is all we need. I'm going to build this out a little bit. Let's expand that. Put that like right around there. Okay, so this is going to be our bumper. I also want to, let's actually relabel that bumper. Okay, I also want to apply a material to this so that I can distinguish between a bumper and a wall. I wouldn't want to assume that something is a wall and then it bumps me, or I wouldn't want to assume that something is a bumper and it's actually a wall. So, and we'll call this player affordance inside of level design. We want to make sure that our mechanics communicate their function. So I'm going to make a material here and call this, let's just call this m_bumper. And let's make this purple, I think would be good. Pink, purple, let's do like that. Okay, and I'm going to assign this, so just drag and drop the material onto the object in the game scene. We're going to go to our object. Okay, so this is going to require a script. Just like before when we had our player, let me open this up. We had our player and we're testing, we're entering a trigger and we're saying, hey, if the other object is a pickup, right? If other object compare tag is pickup, then disable it, enable the count, blah, 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 whatever. I actually don't like the way this is organized. I would rather create a separate object, and on that other script, I would want to detect. So let's say I want to make a script over here, and I want to detect on this script if the player has entered, then affect the player. And the reason why I would want to do that is because every time that I introduce a new object in the level, I don't want to open up the player script and have to define what that object does, right? I want to add a separate script for each of these objects and then affect the player. That would make more sense in terms of organization. So that's how I'm going to set the script up. And it'll get a little bit more confusing, but I'll walk you through each step, and ultimately you can just follow along and just do what I'm doing. So let's put this, let's organize our material into our materials section over there. I'm also going to make a new script. So I'm just going to right click over here, create new C# script and call this bumper. Don't forget to actually drag and apply the script as well. I actually like creating the script before applying it just because I want to make sure it gets in the right folder. So I'm going to drag and drop the script onto the object. And now that we have that done, let's open this up. I'm gonna bring over my thing over here. Okay, so what do we need to make this bumper work? Well, one thing we might need is we might need some amount to determine how much is it bumping the player. And I'm actually going to make this first just as a placeholder. So just like before, we want to expose this amount inside of the inspector. So I'm going to do serialized field. You'll just get used to typing this, I think, by the end of this, this lecture. Of type, this is going to be a value I want to multiply into the speed. So I'm going to make this a float. This is just a decimal number. I'm going to call this bounce amount. and we'll give this a default, something crazy. And if I save this and come back over here, you'll see it should pop up over here. So now we have access to this bounce amount. Okay, cool. So what do I want to do? Now don't forget that this script is on this object over here. And what I want to do is I want to say on trigger enter, if the object that entered this trigger over here is the player, then affect the player. So then we'd say get the player's rigid body and push it. So conceptually, that's what we want to do. So how we would actually put that into code. First thing, remember I'm on the script, this script on my bumper, right? And I want to do on trigger enter. You'll see it'll do an autocomplete. If it doesn't do autocomplete, this is very important. Make sure that if this thing that gets passed in, we want access to this other collider. Make sure that this is collider and not collision. If you're testing on collision enter, then you would want collision other. But in this case, we want collider. So trigger, collider. If those are not the same, it's not going to even call this code properly and it won't work and you're not sure why. Other, you can actually call this whatever you want. You could call this other collision. This is just the name for the variable that we're accessing. So to test this, we'll say, let's figure out in pseudocode what we want to do. If other player, or let's say if other collider is the player, then do something, right? And to do this, we'd say if other dot, so once we access the collider, let me remind you where we are. We're saying if this collider, because it's our on trigger enter is on this script, if this collider, right? So if this collider right here is attached to a game object with a tag player, then continue. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to say if the other collider dot game object, and we actually don't need this little call, but just to make it more clear, if the collider, if this game object is attached to it, compare the tag. You could also do tag is equal to something. Hold on one second. Compare the tag. If it's of type player, then continue. And you can actually double check this over here. Just make sure that whatever you type, when you're doing a string comparison like that, it's usually not ideal, but in this case, just make sure it's the exact, like capitalization does matter here. So make sure you enforce that. So if it's the player, let's actually test this out. Player has entered. Oh, and so this is actually not getting called at all because we have made this and it's a collider, not a trigger. So double check, you do need to do this step to make this a trigger. So I'm going to say, I want this to function as a trigger. I want my player to pass through it, but I still want to detect things. So once we do that, now it should work. All right. So you'll notice this little console window, you can find this if you go up to Window, General Console. If you open this up, you can see any debug.log messages, so you can actually test your code while you go, which I highly recommend. But you'll see every time I enter this trigger volume, it pops up. All right, so we actually know that the code is getting called properly this far. So once we've done this, we can, we've tested that, we're fine. We know we can get this far. So here's what I want to do. I want to access the rigid body on the player, which we already have access to the collision on that player. I can't find it. So we want to, so we're right here on the player. We want to, and we've proven that it's a player by testing the tag. We want to do a search for the rigid body. If we find this rigid body, so it does exist on this object, then we want to apply the force to the rigid body, which will then drive the player movement. So let's actually pseudocode that. Get the player's rigid body so that we can, let's just say get the player's rigid body. Then we'll do the search function. If we found a rigid body, apply the force. You wouldn't want to apply the force to an empty thing. If you searched for it and you couldn't find it, you're just trying to apply it to nothing. And then we'll just do this so far. So to get the player's rigid body, we actually did this in the player controller code up here. Get component will do a local search on this game object. So it will look, if you have this game object, it will look on every single component on this game object, find the type that we're looking for. So if we're looking for rigid body, if we did player's game object dot get component of type rigid body, it will search through and find the first component of type rigid body that it found. We already have access to the game object. So where were we? Bumper. Get the player's rigid body. So we're saying other dot game object dot get component rigid body. So this will return the rigid body that we searched for. Now the problem is we're not storing this into anything. We're just, finding it one time. And maybe we want to store it, maybe we don't. In this case, we do want to store it because I want to access some speed values and things. So I'm just going to make a new one right here. I'm going to say rigid body, and I'll just call this what it is. Player rigid body. Rigid body is equal to, so equal is just setting this. So we're making a new empty container of type rigid body. We're calling it player rigid body. We're doing a search on the player object for the player's rigid body, and we're storing it into this. So now we can access this, and we have now gotten the player's rigid body from a separate script, which is pretty cool. So the next thing, we want to make sure that we actually found something because we did a search. To do this, we just make sure, we would test to make sure that it's not null. And 2 equals is a comparison. 1 equal is an assignment. If we're changing a value or storing a value, we want to do that. But if we're just testing something, 2 equals, we're actually saying is not equal to null. So if it's not null, that means we found something. Null would be there's nothing in there. It doesn't make sense. So if we searched and we found something, then let's get the player's force, or sorry, get the player's velocity and invert it. Then finally, once we've gotten that, apply this force. So then how do we do this? We've gotten this far, and you know what? Maybe we do a quick test. Found player rigid body. If we've hit this point in our code, then we know we're still functional. So it might take a sec to compile. Okay, found player rigid body. So now we have access to the player's rigid body. So to get the player's velocity, we did this before, but I'm actually going to make a new vector 3 just to make this more readable. And we'll call this bounce direction. Now, good practice is to calculate your thing first and then apply it. Technically, you could apply it and then put the calculation in that same line of code. It'll get very unreadable, and I just want to keep things simple. So vector 3, bounce direction. So let's calculate that. What is this? Well, we can get the player's current velocity, so where's a player moving, and reverse it. By adding a little negative here, we're saying get the direction, the arrow that, if you could imagine an arrow in the direction that the player is moving, pretend that it's this way. If we assign negative, it's just going to move it that way, right? It's going to move it in the opposite direction. But we're compiling, okay. So we've calculated what the bounce direction is, which is just whatever the negative direction is of the player's current movement. So we've calculated that, but we still need to apply it. To apply it, again, we're going to access the player rigid body, .add force. And all this is going to be is we've calculated this direction. Let's just add this direction. Right, and this would actually work, but we might also want to control the intensity of the bounce as well. And so the last step is I'm just going to multiply. So we have our force direction, and we're going to multiply that by our bounce amount. And this should be it. If I save that, come back over here, go here, see how it bounces us back. And the reason why, and I know some of you, we went through the lecture on fixed, you know, the applying the forces per frame and the fixed update and all that, how you always want to apply some fixed update. If you're just applying a one-time, imagine it like an explosive force, you're not applying this every single frame. This is generally fine. You're not going to do you're not going to come into any extreme weirdness with this, but this is the simplest way to do it, and it's just a one-time thing, so it's pretty much fine. Anyway, so this is our bumper, and so now you can take this and you can adjust, if you want to adjust the here. You could adjust the bounce amount if you want to make that intense or not that intense, you could. And it's modular, so we could actually duplicate this and make this one a different bounce amount. Maybe this one's only 100, you know, barely anything. And maybe we'll duplicate it again. And this one might be 800, right? Something really intense. And the other benefit of breaking our script out onto a separate object and detecting the player instead of detecting the bumper from the player script is we do have control over this. We can set this per instance of this object. That's going to really shoot me out like that. This one, a little bit. This one, just a tiny little bit. So anyways, we have that working. So next we're going to work on some other mechanics, but try and get this up and running, and just follow along, go back and, you know, get the code snippet if you need it. It's right here. This is the finished script, and make sure you get that functional.